"You don't own anything here," my daughter-in-law whispered at the dinner table, her voice low enough that only I could hear. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even look at her. I finished my meal, folded my napkin, and stood up quietly. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I know how far my story has travelled." The dining room felt wrong without my husband's presence. The oak table he'd refinished himself years ago looked too large now, like it was waiting for people who no longer belonged to me. His chair sat empty at the head of the table, untouched since the day of his funeral. The room still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and roast chicken. But the warmth was gone. It had been 9 days since I buried my husband of 34 years. 9 days since I stood under a grey October sky, holding myself upright while people told me how strong I was. 9 days since I came home to a house that suddenly felt like borrowed space. My son sat across from me that night, scrolling on his phone, barely touching his food. He didn't look up when his wife leaned toward me. He didn't react when she spoke those words, as if they were a simple fact like the weather or the time of day. "You don't own anything here." I watched my fork rest on the edge of my plate. My hands didn't shake, but my chest felt hollow, like something had been scooped out and left open to the air. I thought of all the dinners I'd cooked at that same table. Thanksgiving turkeys, birthday cakes, late night cups of coffee when my son couldn't sleep as a teenager. No one said anything. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. It wasn't awkward, it was intentional. After I stood up, no one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. I rinsed my plate at the sink, listening to the familiar sound of running water, pretending this was just another ordinary evening. When I turned off the faucet, I noticed my reflection in the dark window above the sink. I looked older than my 71 years. Not frail, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from realizing something too late. Upstairs, the guest room door was open. My things had been moved there sometime during the day, not packed, just relocated. My sweaters folded on the bed, my shoes lined up against the wall like they didn't belong anywhere else. The bedroom I had shared with my husband for decades was closed. I stood there for a long moment, my hand hovering near the doorframe, remembering how he used to read in bed every night, his glasses slipping down his nose, how he'd always reached for my hand before turning off the light. Downstairs I could hear my daughter-in-law laughing softly, a relaxed sound. Comfortable. As if nothing had changed. That night, I lay awake on a twin mattress, staring at a ceiling I didn't recognize. The house creaked around me, settling into itself, and for the first time since my husband passed, I understood something clearly. Grief wasn't what made me feel displaced. It was being quietly erased while I was still breathing. I let them believe I was broken. I let them believe I had nothing left, and that was the first mistake they made. The house changed after the funeral, though nothing had physically moved at first. The flowers from the service wilted quietly in their vases, one by one, until I threw them away myself. The sympathy cards sat unopened on the sideboard for days. I already knew what they said. "He was a good man. You were lucky. Stay strong." None of them warned me what came next. Mornings were the hardest. I woke up early out of habit, my body still trained by decades of routine. For a few seconds, I forgot he was gone. I reached across the bed, expecting warmth. Instead, there was only cool air and a neatly tucked blanket on the other side. I dressed quietly, careful not to make noise, though I wasn't sure why. The house was already awake, just not for me. Downstairs, the kitchen felt like a space I was borrowing. My coffee mug had been moved to a lower shelf. My usual chair at the table was gone, replaced with a smaller one pushed slightly away, as if to suggest I wouldn't be staying long. No one mentioned it. They didn't have to. My daughter-in-law moved through the kitchen with confidence, opening cabinets, rearranging drawers, speaking into her phone about schedules and appointments. She never asked if I needed anything. She never looked directly at me unless she had to. My son left early for work each morning. He kissed his wife on the cheek, grabbed his keys, and walked past me like I was part of the furniture. Once he paused near the door as if he might say something. Then his phone buzzed, and the moment disappeared. I ate breakfast alone most days. Toast, coffee, sometimes a banana if I remembered. I kept track of time by the sound of the garage door opening and closing, the rhythm of a household that no longer revolved around me. After breakfast, I wandered the rooms slowly, not aimlessly, carefully. I noticed small changes. A framed photo of my wedding day moved from the hallway to a shelf in the den. My husband's coat missing from the closet. The filing cabinet in his study locked for the first time in years. I didn't ask why. Grief had taught me to observe without reacting. In the afternoons, I sat near the living room window and watched cars pass by. Neighbours waved when they saw me. They still thought I lived there. In a way, I suppose I did. Just without a voice. Once, I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone. She didn't know I was nearby. "She'll adjust," she said casually. "It's better this way. Less confusion." I didn't know who she was supposed to be, but I had a feeling. That night, as I folded laundry in the guest room, I found an envelope tucked between two sweaters. My name was written on it in my son's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a list, utilities, insurance, property taxes, all highlighted. No note, no explanation, just numbers. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the page for a long time. My husband had always handled those things. He used to say it gave him peace of mind, knowing everything was taken care of. I believed him. I trusted him. Now I realized how much I had been protected. I folded the paper neatly and placed it back in the envelope. Then I put it in my purse, the same purse I'd carried for years, the one no one bothered to look inside. That night, lying awake again, I listened to the muffled sounds of the television downstairs, laughter from a sitcom, ice clinking in a glass, life continuing comfortably without me. I didn't cry, I didn't confront anyone. I simply understood something new. I wasn't just grieving my husband. I was being slowly removed from my own life. By the third week after the funeral, patterns began to form. They weren't dramatic, they didn't announce themselves. They slipped in quietly, like changes in the weather you only notice after you've been standing in the cold too long. My daughter-in-law stopped knocking on my door. She would open it halfway, speak without entering, and leave before I could respond. Her tone was always polite, efficient, as if I were a task to be managed. My son started referring to decisions as, "We already talked about it." There was never an invitation for me to join those conversations. One afternoon, I returned from a short walk around the block and found the hallway closet emptied. My coats were gone. Scarves I'd worn for years were folded into a box by the stairs. On top sat a sticky note in neat handwriting, "Seasonal storage." I stood there longer than necessary, reading the words over and over. I didn't argue. I carried the box upstairs myself, my arms aching more than they should have. Later that evening, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. "She doesn't need access to everything," my daughter-in-law said calmly. "It's overwhelming at her age." My son didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was low. "Yeah, you're probably right." That was the moment something settled in my chest. Not anger, not shock. Recognition. They weren't reacting to my grief. They were planning around it. The next morning, I noticed my name was no longer on the family calendar hanging near the refrigerator. Doctor appointments, lunch plans, even reminders to water the plants. All erased. The space where my handwriting used to be was blank. I stood there with my coffee growing cold, realizing I no longer existed on paper. Later that week, my daughter-in-law handed me a small envelope. "Just something we need you to sign," she said, already turning away. Inside was a permission form, authorization to speak on my behalf. Medical, financial, temporary, she'd said, until things were sorted out. I asked one question. "What happens if I don't sign?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Let's not make things difficult." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying small moments I'd dismissed before. The way she always positioned herself between me and my son. How she answered questions meant for him. How he let her. I remembered the first Thanksgiving after they married. I'd offered to cook. She insisted on hosting instead. I remembered how relieved I'd felt, thinking she was simply eager to help. Now I understood. In the following days, more things changed. The mail was sorted before I could reach it. Bank statements disappeared from the counter. My questions were answered with reassurances instead of information. "You don't need to worry about that. We've got it handled. You should rest." Rest became their solution to everything. One afternoon, I tried to enter my husband's study. The door was locked. When I asked about it, my son hesitated, then shrugged. "We're reorganizing." I nodded and walked away. That evening, I sat alone in the guest room and opened my purse. The envelope with the highlighted bills was still there. I spread them out on the bed, studying the numbers. Property taxes, insurance premiums, amounts I recognized but no longer controlled. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd avoided. What exactly do they think I own? The answer came quietly. Nothing they couldn't take. I folded the papers and put them back. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I did something else. I started paying attention. The realization changed how I moved through the house. I became quieter, slower. Not because I was weak, but because I didn't want to be noticed. Attention belonged to them now. I let it stay that way. I started keeping my purse close, not out of fear, out of habit. Inside it were things that mattered more than they realized. Old receipts, a folded warranty, notes my husband had written in the margins of envelopes, small pieces of a life we'd managed together, quietly, for years. Every afternoon I took the same walk around the neighborhood, 2 blocks down, 1 block over, past the blue house with the maple tree and the white mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. People waved. Some stopped to ask how I was holding up. "I'm managing," I said, which was true. When I came back, the house was always active. Phone calls, meetings, paperwork spread across the dining table. I never sat there anymore. My chair remained in the corner, unused. One day, I noticed a new folder on the table. Thick, organized, labeled with my last name. I didn't touch it. Later, when the house was quiet, I stood nearby long enough to read what I could upside down. Legal terms, headers, the kind of language that doesn't ask questions, the kind that makes decisions. That night, I dreamed of my husband. He was standing in the garage, sorting through tools the way he used to on Sunday mornings. He looked up at me and smiled like nothing was wrong, like we still had time. When I woke up, my pillow was dry. In the days that followed, my daughter-in-law began checking in on me more often. Too often. She asked if I was eating enough, if I was sleeping, if I remembered to take my vitamins. Each question sounded kind. Each one carried the same message. You can't manage on your own. One afternoon, she sat across from me in the living room, legs crossed, clipboard resting neatly on her knee. "We just want to make sure everything is taken care of," she said, "for everyone's peace of mind." I nodded. She slid a document toward me, different from the first one, longer, more thorough. "I can explain it if you want," she offered. "I'll read it later," I said. Her smile tightened just slightly. "There's no rush," she replied, "but we do need it signed soon." That night, I closed the guest room door and sat on the bed with the document in my lap. I read every word, slowly, twice. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough. Authority, control, temporary measures that had a way of becoming permanent. I thought of the house, the one my husband and I bought 30 years ago, the down payment we scraped together, the nights we painted walls ourselves to save money, the roof we replaced after the storm. I thought of how easily things could be renamed, managed, reassigned, handled. The next morning, I placed the document back on the table, unsigned. I said nothing. No one mentioned it. That silence told me everything. From that day on, I paid closer attention. I noticed which calls stopped when I entered the room, which emails were printed and which were kept digital. I noticed how my daughter-in-law always positioned herself near the paperwork like a gatekeeper. My son grew quieter around me. He avoided conversations that lasted longer than a minute. When he did speak, his words sounded rehearsed. "We just want what's best," he said once, not meeting my eyes. I didn't argue. Instead, I began remembering things I hadn't thought about in years. A conversation my husband and I had at the kitchen counter, a file he'd mentioned keeping separate, a phrase he used when he wanted me to trust him. "Just in case," he'd said. That phrase returned to me now, steady and clear. One evening, as I folded laundry in the guest room, I found something tucked inside one of my own sweaters, a small key, brass, familiar. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. I closed my fingers around it and sat down slowly. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than grief. I felt certain. They thought I wasn't paying attention. They were wrong. The key fit the lock perfectly. I waited until the house was quiet. My daughter-in-law had gone out with friends. My son was asleep downstairs, the television still murmuring to itself. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if I'd done this 100 times before. The study door opened with a soft click. Nothing inside had changed. The desk, the lamp, the faint smell of old paper and wood polish. It felt like stepping into a room that had been holding its breath. I closed the door behind me. The filing cabinet stood against the far wall. 3 drawers. The bottom one was locked. I knelt down, slid the key in, and turned it. Inside were folders my husband had organised with care. Property records, insurance documents, bank statements, things I recognised, things I didn't. And then, at the very back, a slim envelope. My name was written on it in his handwriting. I sat in his chair and opened it slowly. Inside were copies, deeds, account summaries, a notarized document dated 2 years earlier. My husband's signature was steady, unmistakable. I read it once, then again. The house was still in both our names, not transferred, not reassigned, still ours. Another document followed, instructions, clear, simple. If anything happened to him, I was to retain full authority, no exceptions, no temporary arrangements. I felt something loosen in my chest, not relief, clarity. They hadn't taken anything. They had only convinced themselves they had. I replaced the papers carefully, just as I'd found them. I locked the drawer and returned the key to my pocket. Then I sat there for a few minutes longer, listening to the quiet hum of the house, letting the truth settle. In the days that followed, I changed nothing. I continued my walks. I ate my quiet breakfasts. I answered questions with nods and soft words. I signed nothing. My daughter-in-law grew impatient. I could hear it in her voice, sharp edges slipping through her politeness. "We really should get everything finalised," she said one afternoon, tapping a folder on the table. "I'm still reviewing," I replied. She smiled tightly. "Of course." Later that week, I received a letter in the mail. A bank logo in the corner, my name printed neatly across the front. I opened it alone in the guest room. Account access had been restricted, temporarily. I folded the letter and placed it beside the others in my purse. The collection was growing now, a pattern forming. That evening, my son finally spoke to me directly. "You don't need to worry about finances anymore," he said, standing in the doorway. "We're handling it." I looked up at him. "I know," I said. He hesitated, as if waiting for more. When none came, he nodded and left. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was anxious, because my mind was busy connecting dots. Conversations, documents, timelines. They weren't protecting me. They were positioning themselves. The next morning, I made a phone call from my cell phone while walking past the park. I spoke quietly, briefly, gave a name, asked a question. The answer was calm, professional. "Yes," the voice said. "You're listed as primary." I ended the call and sat on a bench for a moment, watching children play, parents calling out reminders, life moving freely around me. For the first time since my husband passed, I felt grounded. They thought I was confused. They thought grief had softened me. They were wrong. I wasn't lost. I was patient. And patience, I was learning, could be a very dangerous thing. The appointment was set for the following Tuesday. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I dressed the same way I always did. Neutral colours, comfortable shoes, nothing that suggested anything had changed. I took the bus downtown, sitting near the window, watching familiar streets pass by. The city looked the same as it always had. Brick buildings, coffee shops opening for the morning rush, people hurrying with purpose. I stepped off 2 blocks early and walked the rest of the way. The office was quiet, clean, professional. The kind of place where voices stayed low and words mattered. A small plaque by the door carried my husband's name, followed by another name I recognised. Inside, the receptionist greeted me politely and asked me to take a seat. I didn't wait long. When the attorney came out, he paused when he saw me. His expression shifted just slightly. Recognition. Respect. "So I'm glad you came in," he said. So was I. We sat across from each other in a modest office. No drama, no urgency, just paperwork and time. He reviewed documents I placed carefully on the desk. He didn't rush me. He didn't interrupt. When he looked up, his voice was steady. "You're still the legal owner," he said. "Nothing's been changed." I nodded. I already knew that. He explained what the other documents meant, what they didn't, where lines had been crossed, where assumptions had been made without authority. I listened. I asked a few questions, simple ones. What happens if I do nothing? What happens if I do? He answered each one without judgment. When I left, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt prepared. On the way home, I stopped by the grocery store. I picked up a few things I liked. Soup, tea, fresh fruit. I paid with my own card. It went through without issue. At home, my daughter-in-law was sitting at the dining table, tall phone pressed to her ear. She glanced up when I walked in, then looked away quickly. That evening, she brought the folder out again. "We really need to finish this," she said, placing it in front of me. I opened it. I flipped through the pages slowly. I didn't comment. "I'll let you know," I said, and closed it again. Her jaw tightened. Just for a moment. The next day, I received another letter. This one from the bank. An apology, a clarification, access restored. I placed it in my purse with the others. Over the next week, small things shifted. The mail was no longer intercepted. The study door was left unlocked. The conversation stopped when I entered the room, but the tone changed. Careful now. My son tried to speak with me one evening. "We're just trying to help," he said. "I know," I replied. That was all. I began organising my own records in the guest room. Quietly, methodically. I didn't hide anything. I didn't announce it either. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law watched me from the doorway. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Getting things in order," I said. She smiled, but it didn't last. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because everything was resolved, but because for the first time I knew exactly where I stood. They thought control came from paperwork and silence. They hadn't realised I was already several steps ahead. And I wasn't finished yet. By the 7th week, the house had learned my silence. It moved around me more carefully now. Doors closed softer. Conversations paused when I entered, then resumed in lower tones after I passed. Nothing was said outright. Everything was adjusted. I noticed it in small ways. My coffee mug returned to its old spot in the cabinet. My mail appeared unopened on the counter. The guest room door was no longer treated like a boundary, but no one suggested I move back either. They were waiting, so was I. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law asked if I wanted to join her at the dining table. She spread paperwork neatly in front of her, aligned edges, colour-coded tabs. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Just so we're all on the same page," she said. I sat down. She spoke calmly, explained timelines, mentioned efficiency, used phrases like best interest and moving forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She didn't need to. When she finished, she slid a single page toward me, signature line at the bottom, my name typed neatly underneath. I didn't touch it. "I'll think about it," I said. Her smile flickered. She gathered the papers quickly, a little too quickly. "Of course," she replied. That evening my son knocked on the guest room door for the first time in weeks. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded. He stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets, eyes shifting like he was searching for the right words. He talked about stress, about responsibility, about how things had changed since his father passed. "I just don't want you to feel pushed out," he said. I looked at him for a long moment. "I don't," I replied. He seemed relieved. Too relieved. The next morning, I found a printed calendar taped to the refrigerator, family plans, appointments, holidays. My name was listed again, penciled lightly in the margins. It was an invitation. It was also a test. I didn't comment. Over the following days, my daughter-in-law became attentive. She asked if I needed rides, offered to pick things up from the store, suggested lunches together. I accepted some, declined others, always politely, always vague. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I overheard her speaking to someone on the phone. "She's calmer now," she said. "I think she understands." I continued folding. Understanding, I had learned, was often mistaken for surrender. That night, I opened my purse and reviewed what I'd gathered so far. Letters, copies, notes from my appointment, names, dates. Everything organised, quiet, patient. I thought about my husband again, how he used to say nothing and listen when contractors argued, how he waited until everyone else had spoken before deciding. "You learn more that way," he used to tell me. The next morning, I made another call. Brief. Confirming. No urgency. "Yes," the voice said. "Everything is ready when you are." At breakfast, my daughter-in-law mentioned an upcoming family meeting, suggested it would be a good time to finalise things. I nodded and sipped my coffee. "That sounds fine," I said. Her eyes lingered on me, searching for something. Resistance, confusion, weakness. She found none. As the days passed, I noticed my son growing tense. He hovered during conversations, interrupted more often, watched me closely, like he was trying to anticipate my next move. I remained predictable. I walked, I ate, I slept, I smiled when appropriate. Inside, I was steady. They thought the pressure had worked. They thought time was on their side. What they didn't realize was that I had already stepped out of their rhythm. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. And soon, they would hear exactly what I had decided. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. And once it was said, nothing in that house would ever sound the same again. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning. It appeared on the calendar without discussion, printed neatly and taped to the refrigerator. No names listed, just a time. 10 a.m. and a word written in careful handwriting. Family. I saw it and said nothing. In the days leading up to it, the house felt staged, cleaned more thoroughly than usual. Counters cleared, documents stacked and restacked. My daughter-in-law moved with focus, rehearsing conversations in her head, even when she wasn't speaking. My son barely slept. I could hear him pacing late at night, the soft creak of the floorboards outside my door. Once he stopped there, as if considering whether to knock. He never did. On Friday afternoon, my daughter-in-law asked if I wanted help choosing something to wear. For tomorrow, she added lightly. I'll manage, I said. She smiled and nodded, but her eyes stayed on me a second too long. That evening, I laid out my clothes on the bed. Simple, neutral, the kind of outfit that didn't draw attention. I placed my purse beside it, heavier now than it used to be, filled with quiet weight. That night, I slept well. Saturday morning came without ceremony. I made my coffee and sat at the table before anyone else arrived. The chair felt familiar again, solid. At 10 sharp, my daughter-in-law sat across from me. My son took the seat beside her. A folder lay between them. Thick, confident. She began speaking as if she were presenting a plan she'd practiced many times. She talked about responsibility, about efficiency, about what made sense going forward. My son nodded at intervals. I listened. She slid documents toward me one by one, not all at once, carefully paced. Each page carried a purpose. Each line led toward the same outcome. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, she folded her hands and waited. The silence stretched. Finally, I reached into my purse. Not quickly, not dramatically. I placed a single envelope on the table, then another, then a third. I didn't look at them while I did it. I watched their faces instead. My daughter-in-law frowned first. Confusion, then something tighter. My son leaned forward, his brows knitting together as he recognized letterheads. Bank, legal, official. I've already taken care of a few things, I said. My voice was steady, calm, unremarkable. She opened one envelope, scanning quickly, her lips pressed into a thin line. These are old, she said. No, I replied. They're current. My son looked up at me. What does this mean? He asked. It means I won't be signing anything today, I said, or any day. The room felt different then, not tense, alert. My daughter-in-law closed the folder in front of her, slower than she'd opened it. We were just trying to help, she said. I know, I replied. That was all. No accusations, no raised voices, no explanations. I gathered my envelopes and returned them to my purse. I'll be moving back into my room next week, I added. The guest room will be available again. My son opened his mouth, then closed it. My daughter-in-law sat very still. I've already arranged it, I said. I stood up and rinsed my coffee mug at the sink. When I turned around, neither of them had moved. That afternoon, the house was quiet, too quiet. No phone calls, no meetings, no whispered conversations. They stayed in their room for most of the day. I took my usual walk, 2 blocks down, 1 block over, past the leaning mailbox. When I returned, the door to the study was open. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling I recognized again. The familiar crack near the corner, the soft hum of the heater kicking on. They had expected resistance. They had prepared for confusion. What they hadn't planned for was certainty. And certainty, I was learning, didn't need to announce itself. It simply arrived and stayed. The shift didn't happen all at once. It came in pauses, in hesitations, in the way my daughter-in-law checked her phone more often and my son stopped making plans without mentioning them first. They had lost momentum. On Monday morning, I woke early and made breakfast the way I used to. Eggs, toast, coffee brewed strong. I set 3 plates on the table without asking anyone if they wanted to eat. They joined me quietly. No one spoke about Saturday. The study became mine again without announcement. I spent hours there that week, sorting papers into neat stacks, not rushing, not hiding. I left the door open while I worked. Let them see. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law hovered in the doorway. "Are you looking for something?" she asked us. "I already found it," I replied. She nodded and walked away. The house returned to a careful balance. Not comfortable, not hostile, just alert, like everyone was waiting for the next sound. Midweek, a certified letter arrived. This time, it wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to my son. I didn't open it. I placed it on the kitchen counter where he would see it when he came home. That evening, he picked it up slowly, reading the return address twice before opening it. His shoulders tightened as he scanned the contents. He looked at me then. "Did you know about this?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He didn't ask anything else. That night, I heard raised voices behind closed doors. Not shouting. Controlled, pressed, words spoken through clenched teeth. I couldn't make out what they said, but I recognized the tone. Fear doesn't always sound loud. The next morning, my daughter-in-law was gone when I woke up. Her car missing from the driveway, her mug untouched by the sink. My son sat at the table, staring at his coffee. "She's at work," he said, without looking up. I nodded. Later that day, I took the bus downtown again. Same route, same seat, same quiet observation of people living their lives. At the office, everything was ready. Documents signed, instructions confirmed, timelines set. Nothing dramatic. When I returned home, the house felt heavier, as if it knew something had changed before anyone said it out loud. That evening, my daughter-in-law asked to speak with me alone. We sat in the living room. She chose the chair farthest from the door. I noticed that. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she began. I listened. She talked about intentions, about stress, about how difficult the last few months had been for everyone. I let her finish. "I understand," I said. She exhaled, relieved. "I just want us to move forward," she added. "So do I," I replied. There was a pause. She seemed to wait for something more. An apology, a concession. It didn't come. That night, I returned to my room and placed one final document into my purse. The last piece. Everything was aligned now. They thought the meeting had been the turning point. It wasn't. It had only revealed where everyone stood. The real change happened quietly, in preparation, in patience, in not reacting until every option was secure. By the end of the week, the house no longer belonged to assumptions, it belonged to facts. And facts, once acknowledged, don't whisper. They settle, they stay, and they don't move again. The letter arrived on Thursday, hand-delivered, official envelope, my name printed cleanly across the front. I opened it at the kitchen table, alone. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after too many careful days. Inside were copies of documents I already recognized, confirmation, timelines, a date circled neatly in ink. Everything was in motion now. That evening, my son came home later than usual. He didn't take off his jacket. He stood near the counter, reading the room before speaking. "She knows," he said. I nodded. "She's upset." "I imagined she would be." He rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. For a moment, he looked like the boy who used to wait for me to fix things. "What's going to happen?" he asked. "That depends," I said, "on what you decide to do." He swallowed hard. The next morning, my daughter-in-law confronted me. Not angrily, not loudly. She chose calm, as if it were armor. "I think this has gone too far," she said, standing in the doorway of the study. "We were only trying to protect everyone." I closed the folder I was reviewing and looked up at her. "From what?" I asked. She hesitated. "From complications." I held her gaze. "There were no complications until you created them," I said. Her jaw tightened. "You could have talked to us," she replied. "I tried," I said. "You whispered instead." The silence that followed felt final. That afternoon, a moving truck pulled up outside. I watched from the window as boxes were unloaded, not mine. My daughter-in-law supervised, phone pressed to her ear, voice low and clipped. She didn't look at the house. She didn't look at me. By evening, her things were packed. My son stood in the hallway, torn between rooms. "She just needs space," he said. "I understand," I replied. She left that night without saying goodbye. The house felt different immediately, not lighter, clearer. Over the next few days, mail arrived addressed solely to me. Utilities, insurance, property records updated and corrected. Each envelope landed on the table like punctuation. My son began asking questions, real ones this time. What happens next? "What do you want to do?" I answered honestly. "I want my life back," I said. One evening, he sat across from me, eyes tired. "I didn't realize how much I let her decide," he admitted. I didn't respond. Realizations belong to the person having them. The following week, we met again, this time without her. No folders, no rehearsed language, just conversation. He apologized, not perfectly, but sincerely. I accepted it quietly. The locks were changed, the accounts clarified, the guest room returned to its original purpose. On Sunday morning, I sat at the dining table with a cup of coffee and sunlight warming the floor. The chair at the head of the table was empty, but it no longer felt accusing. I thought of the words she had whispered weeks ago. "You don't own anything here." She had been wrong, not because of documents or authority, but because ownership is more than names on paper. It's presence, memory, standing your ground without raising your voice. The house was mine again, and this time no one would mistake my silence for weakness. The house settled into a new rhythm, not hurried, not tense, just steady. Mornings became predictable again. Coffee at the same time, sunlight through the kitchen window landing in the same spot on the floor. I stopped listening for footsteps before moving from room to room. My son adjusted slowly. He asked before making plans. He checked in without hovering. Sometimes we spoke, sometimes we didn't. Either way, the silence was no longer sharp. One afternoon, he brought up the past. I should have said something sooner," he said, standing by the counter. "I thought staying quiet would keep things easier." "It rarely does," I replied. He nodded, accepting it without defense. I began sorting through things I'd avoided since my husband passed. Closets, drawers, old boxes in the garage labelled in his handwriting. I didn't rush. I took breaks when I needed them. Grief no longer felt like something pressing against my chest. It felt like something I could carry. I donated what I didn't need, kept what mattered. Some objects held memories, others only dust. Letting go felt different this time, intentional, clean. One evening, while organising the study, I found a notebook tucked behind a row of manuals. My husband's handwriting filled the pages. Notes, reminders, lists he never shared because he trusted I'd figure things out if I needed to. On the last page, a single sentence. "You always know when it's time." I closed the notebook and sat there for a long moment. That night, I slept deeply. The following week, my daughter-in-law returned to collect the last of her things. She didn't come alone. She brought a friend. A witness, perhaps. I wasn't in the room when they packed. I didn't need to be. Before she left, she stood in the doorway, keys in hand. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said. I looked at her. "But it did," I replied. She waited, as if expecting more. Forgiveness. Reassurance. It didn't come. She nodded once and left. The door closed softly behind her. In the days that followed, neighbours stopped by. Some brought food. Others brought stories about my husband I hadn't heard before. We laughed. We remembered. Life didn't rush back in. It returned politely. One Sunday afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the street the way I used to. Cars passed. Children rode bikes. Someone waved. I waved back. Ownership, I realised, wasn't about asserting control. It was about refusing to disappear. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't threatened. I hadn't pleaded. I had waited, observed, acted when the moment was right. That was enough. The house carried my footsteps again. The walls held familiar sounds. I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. When I thought back to the whisper that started it all, it no longer stung. It sounded small now, mistaken. I folded my husband's notebook and placed it in the drawer where I kept important things. Not locked, just there. Some truths don't need protection, they need acknowledgement. And once they're acknowledged, they don't leave. They settle in quietly, just like I did. The house was quiet the morning I realised the story had ended. Not the uneasy quiet that follows conflict. Not the silence that waits for another argument to begin. This was different. It was settled, complete. I stood in the kitchen holding my coffee, watching the sunlight stretch across the floor, the same floor my husband and I had walked across thousands of times, the same floor where I had once stood, unsure if I still belonged. Now there was no question. I moved through the room slowly, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I touched the edge of the dining table, straightened a picture frame, opened a window to let the morning air in. Everything felt familiar again. My son left for work that day after asking if I needed anything from the store. I told him no. He smiled, kissed my cheek, and left without hesitation. No glances back, no tension trailing behind him. I sat down in the study afterward, the door open, the desk clear. I placed my husband's notebook in front of me and opened it to the last page again. You always know when it's time. I did. It wasn't the moment I found the documents. It wasn't the meeting at the table. It wasn't when she left the house. It was now. Time didn't mean confrontation. It meant peace. That afternoon, I walked through the neighborhood as I always had, 2 blocks down, 1 block over, past the leaning mailbox. The woman in the blue house waved. I waved back. When I returned, I noticed something small but important. My name was back on the mailbox, not added, restored. That evening, I cooked dinner. Nothing special, just something warm. I ate alone at the table without feeling lonely. The empty chair no longer felt heavy. It felt remembered. Afterward, I washed the dishes and dried them carefully, placing each one where it belonged. I turned off the lights downstairs and paused at the bottom of the stairs. Once, those stairs had felt like a line I wasn't sure I was allowed to cross. Now, I climbed them without thinking. In my room, I changed into pajamas and sat on the bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling for the night. Pipes adjusting, wood contracting, quiet, honest noises. I thought about the whisper that had started everything. You don't own anything here. At the time, it had cut deep, not because it was true, but because it was meant to be believed. Now, it sounded small. Ownership, I had learned, isn't declared by the loudest voice. It isn't taken by pressure or paperwork slid across a table. It's claimed by standing still when others expect you to disappear. I hadn't fought, I hadn't begged, I hadn't rushed, I had waited, I had remembered who I was before anyone tried to tell me otherwise. That night, before turning off the light, I placed my purse on the chair beside the bed. Lighter now. Not because it was empty, but because it no longer needed to carry proof. Everything I needed was already in place. As I lay down, I felt something close around me gently. Not grief, not anger. Closure. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that doesn't demand an audience. It simply settles in, just like I did. And for the first time in a long while, I slept without wondering where I belonged. I already knew.